Well, we are counting down to the end of 2022. It was truly an eventful year in Africa. So today we want to take a moment and review some of the stories that dominated the headlines across the continent. For that, I'm joined in studio by my colleague, Salem Solomon, VOA's News Center Multimedia editor, and Jackson Mvunganyi, host of VOA's Red Carpet TV program. And now, to both of you, thank you very much. And I'm happy to be with you
Vincent.
after such a long time.
Yes.
Okay, now let's start with, there were so many things that happened, but we want to just look at some of those. And I think one of the biggest stories was the Ethiopia-Tigray conflict. In terms of where we are at the moment, looking at how it was covered, Salem, what would you say?
In Ethiopia, the peace negotiation between the Tigray People's Liberation Front and the federal government is kind of materializing as we see it, if it continues like what's happening in the past 2 weeks. But it's very fragile. It's very fragile in a sense that, people are still trying to see how far it will hold. We saw the families reuniting after a complete blackout in Tigray for quite some time. Almost reminiscent of what happened in 2018 when the peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia happened. And so we'll see. But what remains right now is that, you will see, hopefully, we'll see if, the peace will hold. And also, there are millions displaced. And so, and also there are millions of communities basically facing hunger and things like that because of the remnant.
But it's positive. You could say at least we've started seeing food going in.
Right, absolutely, right? Vincent. When this war started, the conflict started a couple of over 2 years ago. We said there can never be any winners here, and 2 years later, many thousands of people dead. It's good that we're ending the year with this, what the UN called a de facto blockade, essentially ending with this flight to Makori this week. People opening up spaces, international humanitarian aid flowing into Makori and other parts of Tigray. So we're ending the year on a positive note, really, and hopefully that this peace agreement will hold.
Yeah, we want this peace. We want this peace. But let's move on to the next story that was really big on the continent, was to do with hunger and a drought in parts of Africa. It was the Horn of Africa area, Kenya, and you were all the way to West Africa.
Right.
Salem.
Right. Unfortunately, 2022 has been horrible. You have the aftermath of a global pandemic that has impacted not just the continent, but the world. As countries were still recovering from that, you have that, and then you have cyclical, climate issue that impacts the Horn of Africa plus other regions, and then you have economic, issues because of the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. And so the combination of all these three factors, conflict, climate change, has really exacerbated the existing problems that these countries have in the Horn, especially Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia. There are people in really dire situation. The UNICEF just a week ago or so was saying around 20.2 million children are now facing a threat of severe hunger, the worst kind of devastation.
About 2 rainy seasons or even 4, I think. But Jackson, that also became a conversation at the COP27, which happened in Africa.
Absolutely. A historical event happened Sharm El Sheik in Egypt. I think one of the positive things, actually the most positive thing about that was the loss and damage agreement, where richer nations agree now to pay Africa or the poorer nations for some of the impact of climate change, including the droughts that we've seen that have been affecting the region, the Horn of Africa, for these past couple of years. We've had a very difficult couple of years in terms of climate change on the continent. I think COP27, instead of these people just going in for meetings and talking, having discussions, I think this time around we had something that's more tangible in terms of helping the continent.
Let's hope somebody pays attention. Now, turn to politics. This is one thing that really frustrates people on the continent. But we witnessed some elections but also some coups.
Right.
Salem, let's start with the elections. What stood out, and which elections?
You know, the elections, and we've seen you cover in Kenya. I mean, it was quite a surprise, actually, to see the result of the elections in Kenya. You were upfront, really following it. So it was surprising, but you know, you see democratic processes, very positive democratic processes, basically implemented and playing out on the continent. Very positive.
Very positive.
Yeah.
But then,
Right. No, Vincent, listen, it's 2022. We should not be talking about coup d'etats in Africa anymore. Listen, that should be past us right now. Yeah. But again, the encouraging thing is in Angola, Kenya, we've seen these elections, peaceful elections. We always have these doomsday conspiracies about elections in Kenya each time it happens. But again, they have proved us wrong, and we saw a peaceful transition of power. A ruling party losing, I don't know whether you'd call it a ruling party, but a ruling coalition really losing, and people accept the results, and life moves on.
It's very encouraging.
Right. I want to mention about the trend that we saw in West Africa. You have Guinea, 2 coups in Burkina Faso, these movements that are very troubling, because when you see these coup leaders come into power, they have trouble in maintaining, because they use heavy-handed tactics to maintain power. And so you see this trend in West Africa, and we saw in Sao Tome, in Mali, so many places where Guinea-Bissau. And the problem is that other African countries look at each other to see how these things play out, and you have coups and counter coups, 1 or 2 of them, and it's very troublesome to see the trend. And there are other foreign powers at play that benefit from instability
on the continent.
At the expense of African people. But very quickly, 2 events took place outside of the African continent, but were very important to the continent.
Right.
The U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. Let's start with that, and you covered
the
part
Africa
of that.
Leadership Summit. Yes, a very important summit. The U.S. plans to spend $55 billion over the next 3 years on the African continent, kind of countering the impact of Chinese loans on the continent. The soft power we always talk about. But the one thing that I have not seen is I've not had any African leaders actually sitting with their people since they left Washington, D.C. to talk about what came out of the meeting. So those are some of the things where, when you're talking about your core constituency and their needs, what kind of conversations are you having? Instead of just coming to Washington, D.C., having these grand meetings, negotiations, discussions, and going back home and then, keeping quiet, what are you talking to about with your people about?
Right. I would like to also mention, when we were talking about conflicts in Africa, the silver lining, I would say, in 2022 is that, the long sought for African solutions for African problems. You see it materializing. You have Ethiopia, the African Union really stepping in to mediate. You have, even in the DRC, where the East African community coming in, stepping in, making these African organizations stepping in, trying to make, to end conflict. But coming back to the U.S. Africa, my main takeaway was when this administration, President Joe Biden said, Africa belongs on the table, pushing for the G20, Africa to be included in that. I think it's very promising, and also the recurring usage of the word partnership. And you see that. It's very important to see. Yes, there were so many takeaways, so many signs, signing of deals.
It's like we're not here to lecture you, we want to work with you.
Absolutely. For me, the most important part was this push towards engaging with the African diaspora. The African diaspora is also a very core constituency in terms of sending remittances back home. We send way more money than foreign aid and other types of trade. So engaging with the diaspora, I think, is quite important, and I'm glad that they actually, brought that to light.
Some certain countries, like the Jewish diaspora, the Asian countries have very powerful diaspora communities. But another event, and you covered big time, that is the World Cup.
Oh yes, this was Africa's year at the World Cup. Did you watch the World Cup?
Well, I was watching it from here.
But listen, Vincent, this was Africa's year, no doubt. Morocco made us proud. I was in Ghana covering it from Ghana. The Black Stars, the national team, were representing in Qatar. But overall, I think this once every 4 years event, for the first time, Africa really outdid itself. And going forward, I think we have.
Morocco was literally smelling the World
Right.
Cup. It was like right there.
I was actually really energized watching Jackson just,
Doing his thing in Ghana.
doing his thing. My main takeaway is, when we saw Tim Weah, son of
George Weah.
George Weah, scoring for the U.S.
Yeah.
I felt even locally here from Washington, D.C., we saw a lot of prominent newspapers really doing a feature, giving Africa its
rightful place.
rightful place. Right?
Africa was at the World Cup all
Right.
the way
Absolutely.
to the
Right.
final.
I kept calling France the other African team.
Yeah, it was the other African
Basically,
team.
and that's my one main takeaway watching all the way from here. Another one is to see how many African coaches are taking their rightful places.
Yes.
And so that was
All
very
the teams were
All the
coached by
teams,
Right.
Africans.
Exactly.
And you know what? I wish we had all the time. But again, talking about Weah's son, I was just happy to see a son of a president who works.
Right.
He works. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Vincent.
Right.
Such a pleasure.
Really
Happy New
appreciate
Year.
it. Thank you very much.
Happy
And
New Year.
what a year